Hey, welcome back everyone to our Wednesday afternoon Bible study. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. Hopefully this is going to give you a little break from the rabid election cycle watch. Hopefully this can tear you away from the TV just for a few minutes and give you something else to focus on, get you in a different mindset right now. We're reflecting on the Gospel of John. That's our Bible study. We're walking through John's Gospel. We changed up our format a little bit, so instead of setting us to a specific date and time on Zoom, I'm uploading these videos. You can watch along with me, or if you prefer, you can just skip right to the study guide, which I upload for you every Wednesday afternoon with the video, and you can track with what we're talking about and use that study guide as a resource for your own spiritual development. So we've been walking through the Gospel of John. Last week we started the first part of John 13 of this long teaching session where Jesus sits down with his disciples at a meal that he shares with them and instructs them on how their life should look after he leaves them. So some scholars call it the farewell discourse, others call it the upper room discourse. It's a time that Jesus spends intimately with his discipleship group of 12, soon to be 11, as you'll see today. And it's a time of instruction and wisdom for his discipleship group as they continue on the mission after Jesus has left them and ascended to the Father. So we looked last week at the foot washing, which begins and kind of frames the whole scene, the whole upper room discourse, and really foreshadows the crucifixion that is coming. Jesus' humiliation on the cross is foreshadowed in the foot washing scene. There's a lot of similar language that will pop up when Jesus is crucified. But we transition now to the next scene in the story, the next scene in the long upper room discourse, which is the narrative of Judas's betrayal of Jesus. So in the scene, this is going to be John 13, verses 21 to 30. So that'll be the text assigned for you in the study guide. The scene begins with Jesus being overwhelmed by a sense of trouble, of despair, of sadness. The scene begins with Jesus being troubled, it says. And the word for trouble in Greek really is a unique word that John uses only 3 times in the Gospel. And this is the third and last time it shows up. If you were with us for the Lazarus story, it shows up there, and one other time earlier in the Gospel. But Jesus is deeply affected by knowing what is to come. It begs the question what he's troubled by, and there's several different takes, and I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. One is that he's troubled about the fact that he's coming face to face now with the great battle with sin, darkness, death, the enemy, the Satan, the adversary. He's coming face to face with it, and it's an overwhelming feeling of sort of anxiety as he comes up to it. There's a deep pathos that as he walks up to this moment, it's becoming very real to him, and it is a little bit overwhelming as he looks at it. There's some of that. He also seems very controlled over the situation, so he knows what is coming, but is still not maybe not happy to meet it in the sense like he's not looking forward to dying on the cross. It's a humiliating act he's about to experience. There's also a sense that he very well may be troubled by the fact that his closest friends are going to abandon him. This discipleship group that he has formed, this group of students and learners that he's gathered around himself, they're going to fail him. In fact, as we will discover just in a few minutes, Judas himself, who is one of the highly respected members of the group, is going to be the one that seals his fate and puts him to death. And so you get the sense that might as well be a sort of feeling of trouble for him. And then also there's this aspect that as he comes to the table now and begins this instruction, what may be troubling him is the fact that his disciples honestly still don't get it. He spent this time with them. He's invested and poured out his life into them. And so now he gets to this point where it's coming to the end and he's realizing, man, these guys, they just still haven't connected. They haven't gotten it. They haven't clicked. And that as well may be sort of troubling. And I would suggest it's kind of all of these things. His coming death, his battle with sin and Satan and the enemy and the darkness of the world, his recognition that his best friends will sell him out and that they really are kind of ignorant of what he's been trying to teach them. All of that is troubling to Jesus, and that sets the scene that we enter into this afternoon. Judas is at the table still. He hasn't left the scene. And Jesus makes an announcement from this place of trouble, from this place of angst. He says, somebody here is going to betray me. And of course, everybody at the table starts to wonder, who is it? Is it you? Is it me? This is kind of strange. Interestingly, about the passage, we kind of get a sense from this text where people are seated, at least a few key people are seated, based on the way the story is told. So the beloved disciple, who we don't really know who is that beloved disciple. Some people think it's John, and for our purposes, we'll just say it's John. But there's people who think differently. First time we hear of it, the beloved disciple is at the table, and we hear that he's right next to Jesus. So when Jesus makes this announcement, somebody's going to betray me, we hear that Peter, who must be sitting a little bit away from John, kind of signals to John, or signals to the beloved disciple, like, hey, ask Jesus, right? So he's not close enough that he can talk to him, but he doesn't want to shout it out from across the table. He wants to be a little bit more discreet. So Peter kind of looks at John, or looks at the beloved disciple and says, hey, kind of ask Jesus. Psst, get the information, get the download from Jesus. So we hear that the beloved disciple, who again we'll just call John leans into Jesus and says, Jesus, who is it? And Jesus says, it's the one who I will share this morsel with, this piece of bread with. And he dips it in the food, and he gives it to Judas. Now, in my understanding of the text, and most commentators will say, that conversation was private between John and Jesus. And that makes a little bit more sense of the confusion in the scene later on when Judas does leave. People don't know why. If Jesus had announced that this was, the morsel, when I give it to somebody, that's the one that's going to betray me, and then everybody saw he gave it to Judas, then it would, everybody would know, hey, it's Judas, he's out. But the confusion of the scene seems to indicate that Jesus and John have this kind of private conversation, and Judas gets the bread. Now, this is a very crucial thing to understand for the text. It seems kind of innocent, but it's really important for the text. When Jesus gives Judas this morsel of bread, what we miss from a 21st century world to the first century, we miss this idea of honor at the meal. So if John is right next to Jesus at the table, that's a position of honor. He leans in, talks to Jesus, they have that private conversation. And then if Jesus takes the bread and hands it right next to him to Judas, that means that Judas is also in a very highly respected honor position at the table with Jesus. So that, plus the fact that Jesus hands him the bread, so dips his hand in and gives him and shares the meal with Judas, this is to indicate that Judas is being very well respected at the scene. It's a very ironic moment. Everybody sees Judas here at this scene being honored and respected, being given bread by the master, being given part of the meal by their Lord, by their teacher, their rabbi. This is a huge sign of respect and honor to Judas. And so it really ironically sets up the scene to make it hurt even more, to make it even more painful that this one who's being honored and respected at the table is precisely the one who's going to sell Jesus out. We get this language that at this moment, Satan, or what we call the adversary or the accuser, enters into Judas, and Judas makes his final decision to leave. He gets up from the table and he leaves out with the intention of selling Jesus out and putting him to death. Jesus is not surprised by this. In fact, he knows. He even kind of indicates to Judas that he knows. And what's interesting is as the scene sets, Judas leaves, And John, or the gospel writer John, says that Judas leaves and goes into the night. He goes into darkness. Now, you would think that's maybe just a sort of scene setting and the close of the moment, but it's actually incredibly important in the way that John has written his gospel. John, all throughout the gospel, has been playing with themes of light and dark, day and night. For John, light and day indicates the dawning of something new, the beginning of a new day, the beginning of a new creation. Light indicates for John instruction, enlightenment, we call it, right? Knowing and recognizing what God is up to in the world, being a part of what God is up to in the world. Living with God means to live in the light with God, according to John's gospel and to his letters as well, when you read those. Darkness is everything opposed to that. In fact, darkness is trying to snuff out the light all throughout John's gospel. Darkness is associated with death, with despair, with emptiness, with everything that is contrary to what God is doing in the world. It gets in the way. It tries to choke out the light. And so at the end of the scene, as Judas leaves, he leaves, and the gospel writer makes it very clear that he leaves and goes into the night. He goes into the darkness. It's this symbolic moment where Judas has resigned himself to refuse the day, to live not in the day of God's new making, but to instead leave and go into the darkness and to participate and become complicit with all of the forces that are in opposition to what God is up to in the world. It's at that moment that everything begins for Jesus' battle here with death and the Satan. So as we reflect on this text, it's interesting on a couple of levels, but primarily I think it's interesting because it sets the scene for what is about to take place in Jesus' battle with the darkness, with death, with injustice and hate, and with the forces of the adversary, the forces of Satan. As it sets that scene, it reminds us that God is not sort of caught off guard by the darkness, but that he's willing to face it head on. That he doesn't just ignore it, but that he actually comes at it full force and resolves it in what we will come to see as the death of his son and the resurrection to new life. But that's for another day. That's where we're going to stop this afternoon. I'll invite you to take a look at the study guide and to track along with us using that study guide as a resource for your own Bible study and spiritual development. If you have feedback, if you have questions, if you're interested in book recommendations on the Gospel of John, you can email me at office.aecc@gmail.com. You can drop a comment in the Facebook post, or you can just leave a note on YouTube as well. We'll make comments available there. Great, so look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless, and hey, hang in there, and the election results will eventually come in soon. Take care, bye.